good.
All right, everyone, thanks for coming. Thanks for joining us on Zoom, if you're on Zoom. We're very pleased to have Dr. Nata Duvvury here from the University of Galway. So she's come all the way from Ireland, but then before that was in Papua New Guinea, so she's been traveling all over the place. And so we're really pleased to have her here with us this week. She's an expert in gender, labor markets, welfare states, globalization, and particularly on the economic costs of violence. And she was, well, one of the ways that we got to meet each other is that she actually brought about a domestic violence leave policy at her own university. So the very first university in Ireland, right, to adopt such a policy. We have those policies here in Ontario and throughout most of the rest of Canada, much due to the work of Barb McCrory, who unfortunately couldn't be here today from our pre-vac center. And so today, that's what she's going to be talking about, is what about these domestic leave policies and telling us a bit about her own experiences in this area. So, Amy, and thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, Audra, and hello to everyone. So this is, I feel a little bit tenuous because it's in the Network for Economic and Social Trends. I'm not going to give you equations. I'm not going to give you regressions. I mean, there are no coefficients, nothing. This is just talking about the importance of understanding why domestic violence is a workplace issue. Now, I'm speaking probably to a highly converted audience, but at the same time, I think it's important for us to remind ourselves why it is important. And maybe potentially some students haven't thought about this as a workplace issue. The second is that to try, I started this review of trying to understand where are we now with workplace policies. Because as Audra said, yes, Canada, Ontario was one of the first provinces to have a domestic violence leave policy. But this is something that is only beginning to unfold in the rest of the world. So I just wanted to give a sense of what is the policy context for this growing interest in having workplace policies, and particularly a domestic violence leave policy. And then I just wanted to look at what are some of the gaps in the legislations that have been passed, what are some of the issues with policies that have been implemented, and are there any evaluations on effectiveness of these policies? We've invested a lot in making the case, but actually we have very little that has evaluated. So that's kind of the story that I will tell. For some of you, it's a familiar story. For some of you, it could be a slightly new story. But my central message has been, wherever I have spoken, is to try and bring domestic violence, which is seen as a cultural issue, at most a human rights issue, and sometimes a public health issue, as a central economic issue that affects women's workforce participation. Because we have done a lot on gender equality to say we must have women's economic empowerment. But women's economic empowerment is meaningless if it does not address and ultimately eliminate violence against women. We know that violence against women, we have said, work is a source of empowerment. But unfortunately, violence can become a source of undermining women's work participation, undermining women being able to realize the potential benefits of being in the labor force. And so there's that, very complex, intertwining relationship between work and empowerment and violence against So it's really about domestic violence in the world of work. Domestic violence, we know work happens in a space that's private, that feminist economists have been arguing that the private and the public have to begin to be analyzed together, and that an issue like domestic violence doesn't remain in the realm of the private space. It has public impacts. There are spillover impacts. How do you do this? Oh, I made it look important. Oh, that's, okay. So one of the starting points for me that brought me to this issue of domestic violence as an economic issue was really to think about women's work participation in the whole agenda around decent work. As feminist scholars such as Jill Duvvury, they have established that theoretically and empirically, gender norms impact on the participation, the level, the extent of participation of women in the economy, right? We all know that. And I hope that all of you know that in this room. And that therefore these gender norms have impacts on the nature of participation, where women are concentrated, precarious work that women do, etc. And feminist scholars, feminist economists have largely argued around the nature of trying to understand the workplace and to develop a decent agenda. But at the same time, very few feminist economists have paid attention to the issue of domestic violence and its interactions with the workplace. There has been modeling of domestic violence trying to explain why it happens, and we have the bargaining models to basically say it's the level of power difference and that women have less resources and therefore violence occurs as a way of controlling women. But how does the violence at home impact on work? And so there has been a lot of literature that has established that violence at home can affect workplace productivity because women will be absent from work, women will have presenteeism where they are not productive at work, there is tardiness, and ultimately it undermines women's workforce participation. And all of this that kind of evidence has led to a focus on the decent work agenda in ILO. Now the decent work agenda at ILO initially focused on erasing the barriers that prevent women from working and to some extent improve the conditions of work, right? But the decent work agenda did not necessarily talk about violence against women as a fundamental barrier to women's participation, nor addressed the potential impacts of violence at the workplace affecting the decent work agenda. That violence that women experience at home can have an impact at the workplace, which keeps them in precarious employment, which keeps them in low-wage employment, etc. Right? So the decent work agenda was very important, but it didn't integrate domestic violence as an issue that had to be addressed. And in this discussion around domestic violence, because it's seen as a cultural, social issue primarily, there has been very little discussion about the role of the private sector in addressing domestic violence. It has been, much of our advocacy has been focused on governance and laws, but not about what can be done in day-to-day working that women do in the office, in the So there has been very little attention focused on the business sector as a potential ally in addressing domestic violence, and also that there should be conditions of where the workplace becomes a safe workplace, right? So in that kind of trying to understand, trying to draw the private sector as an ally, there has been a lot of evidence being built up around why DV is a workplace issue. I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but it's important to try and get this message across very strongly. So first, DV is a workplace issue because women are often killed at the workplace. And there's been evidence showing that homicides of women is in fact in the US is the fourth largest workplace issue, the murder of women in the workplace. And a significant proportion of those murders in the workplace are by intimate partners. So it is domestic violence that is coming to the office, factory, to the gates, parking lot, etc. So business is involved. And in this way, DV is a workplace issue. So in the US, 38% of workplace homicides between 2008, 1982 and 2011 were perpetrated by an intimate partner violence. And this estimate now has risen to 42% of homicides of women at the workplace are by an intimate partner in 2017. So you see that it is a fairly big issue. And in Ireland, according to Women's Aid, which is one of the largest organizations that works on intimate partner violence, about 1/3 of the homicides that occurred outside of the home occurred at the workplace. It's trying to show that domestic violence is the murder of women happens not only in the home, but it does happen within the public realm, and homicides in the public realm are done by the intimate partner. And it ripples into the workplace because it doesn't stop at the picket fence of the house, and women who experience domestic violence continue to face domestic violence at home. Barbara McQuarrie, your colleague, has done a lot of work in Canada to show how domestic violence flows into the workplace and the continuation of domestic violence at the workplace. So these are some basic data to show that a trade union report in 2014 in the UK basically showed that 81% of women who said that they experienced domestic violence who were working reported that they were harassed through the phone and messages while at work. 47% said that their partner physically turned up at the workplace to harass them. And 43% said partner stalked them outside of the workplace. So you see that it doesn't stop at the home. And in Canada, the study that was done by University of Western Ontario, a survey of Canadian women who were employed, showed very similar results. And this is just because I think we often don't think of how women working do constantly have this additional pressure on them. And it's a continuous pressure. It's not just they can lock the door to the home, come into the office with no worries, because it continues, the level of harassment. And we had done studies in developing countries, in the global south, to see is this the same phenomenon that occurs in the global south. So in a study that we did with funding from UK Department of International Development, we found that in Ghana and Pakistan and South Sudan, almost the same levels. Women who are working reported the same level of continuation of harassment at the workplace. So whether it is in the most developed society or whether it is in the economies that are in transition, this violence is there constantly undermining the potential of women who are employed. And this is the important thing, it's about employed women that economists tend to think of as the human capital. So your human capital is constantly being undermined. And the potential of human capital is constantly being undermined. And it also showed that the survey that the trade union did showed that women had difficulty in reaching work. So if they're working, they still have difficulty in reaching work. So that intimate partner violence often results in behaviors by the partner, such as taking the keys, hiding the keys, preventing the woman from going to work, as well as having personal documents being taken from them so that they cannot apply for jobs or continue with their jobs. Having threats, almost 70% said that they had threats. 27% had refusal to show up to care for children. So if they were divorced and had some sort of care arrangements, partners would not come up or ex-partners would not show up. And so the woman was unable to go to work. So this is also another constraint. You're working, but you're not able to reach work. So that is another way in which DV is a workplace issue. And ultimately, DV then therefore impacts performance at work. And now, it's not just DV. We know that in management studies, there is a great emphasis being placed on the burden that presenteeism is presenting to business productivity and profitability. And DV is actually one of the most important causes for a significant amount of presenteeism at the workplace. And so you see that about 57% said that they had to take time off from work. So absenteeism is an issue. 50% said that they were late for work. And it's not late for work once in a while. It's late for work probably quite frequently. And 86% said that their work performance was affected by being distracted, being worried, being confused, having a sense of hopelessness all the time. So you have this productivity impact. And this often leads to that women are let go of their employment because of poor performance. And in the Canadian survey, they found that 8.5% of the respondents said that they were fired due to domestic violence. So look at this contrast. We say that the way out of domestic violence is to work, but domestic violence creates the conditions for women to be fired from work, for women to have poor performance, for women therefore to be confined into particular segments of the labor market. And the impacts that we've talked about that have come from studies in the global north are actually replicated in the global south. And so it's a universal phenomenon. So when we talk about development of countries in the global south, violence is an underpinning issue that really potentially undermines the potential for growth and development. And so so we found that I think all of you have had Aristides here before. He did a study in Peru in which women reported that they lost 24 working days due to tardiness, absenteeism, and presenteeism. We found very similar results in Ghana and Pakistan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Palestine, and Jordan, and Vietnam. So this is not a phenomenon that is confined to the global north. And in Ghana, we found women missed about, overall, in the survey that we did of 2,000 women in Ghana, the accumulated loss of days due to presenteeism, absenteeism, and tardiness came to 64 million workdays. 64 million workdays amounted to 4.6% of the employed women in Ghana effectively not working. Okay? So the loss of workdays was equivalent to 4.6% of the Ghanaian working force, female working force, not working. So that's a huge amount of loss in a developing country. And that productivity loss was based on each woman reporting 14 days of loss due to domestic violence in Ghana. So this seems like, yes, I hope that convinces you that it is a pretty big issue. And on top of it, all of this combines to affecting women's career progression. So this is a survey done by KPMG for Vodafone across all of the different offices of Vodafone. And what they found was that a significant proportion of women did report that violence, domestic violence, and all of the cumulative effects of it affected their progression of career by nearly 40% across different countries. Either seriously affected or moderately affected. So this again is when we think about women's empowerment, then this is one of the biggest issues in the labor market, right, for women, that we don't progress. That the SDGs has said the percentage of women who are in managerial and directorship positions is going to be the marker of achieving gender equality in SDG 5. But this shows us that violence, in fact, can actually become a factor that prevents that rise of women up the ladder within the labor market. And therefore, again, unless you address violence, you can't actually achieve any of your SDG goals, especially SDG 5. So therefore, domestic violence is a workplace issue, and the other important dimension of this is that survivors of violence often have lower income. They earn less income. And in Vietnam, we did a study which showed that they earned less than, their earnings were almost 30% lower than those who do not have experience of violence. And this lower income translates into a significant productivity loss for the economy as a whole. And the impacts on career progression really arise, at least in part, from reduced workplace productivity as well as the additional absences from work and the mental health issues that can be related to domestic violence. So essentially, domestic violence does undermine a decent work agenda, unless it is specifically integrated into a response at the workplace. body of evidence that really informed the ILO 190 Convention, which for the first time introduced the concept of domestic violence as one form of violence which is important to consider in the world of work. And that marks a significant departure, because up to that point, workplace violence was commonly understood to be harassment and bullying, sexual harassment and bullying at the workplace. ILO 190 has expanded that understanding now. So the world of work, the violence in the world of work includes domestic violence, violence which occurs within the home, as well as violence that occurs in the reaching of the office, so through public transport, etc. It includes violence in cyberspace, and it includes the violence at the workplace. But that the violence at the workplace can also include the spillover of domestic violence to the workplace. So the harassment, the stalking by an intimate partner is part of the violence in the world of work. And this is important because why? Why would you, sorry, this is not a classroom. This is where I would get the students to talk. It's important because it is now beginning to bring the public and the private together. Because in all of our models, if you are economists here, you have to think, how much has violence been factored into our understanding of human capital? Do we think of violence as an element that's important for that human capital? That labor input, what shapes that labor? What are the experiences of that labor that have to be taken into consideration? So that way, this is a very important departure. And it has obligated all employers, states, and trade unions to understand and recognize domestic violence, as well as implement specific interventions to mitigate the impacts of domestic violence, as well as institute preventative efforts. Okay? So this marks really a significant departure. Much of it is owed to the work that colleagues like Barbara have done and have been able to engage with trade unions and to bring to the ILO Convention a whole body of evidence that could not be refuted. And so that's very important. So ILO Convention 190 marks a significant departure. So but what has been then, the progress that's been made since ILO Convention was passed and agreed to in 2019? The progress has been really, really slow. In fact, only 32 countries have ratified the ILO Convention as of, what month are we in?
October.
I'm sorry.
October.
Like, I don't anymore know where I am, or etc. So as of up to October, only 32 countries have ratified. And in only 20 countries is it in force. So you can ratify it, national governments ratify it, and then the convention has to be in force where it becomes kind of the national legal obligation of the government to ensure that there are legislations to address what should be done under the ILO Convention. So it's only in force in 20 countries. And this is a fairly slow movement because other ILO conventions have tended to be ratified and in force much quicker. This is now 4 years, almost 4 years later. And the countries that have actually enforce are Argentina, Ecuador, Fiji, Greece, Italy, Mauritius, Namibia, Somalia, South Africa, UK, and Uruguay. What's missing is a significant number of European countries that keep talking about human rights. Canada has only ratified the convention in 2023 in January, and it won't come into force until August 2024. And surprisingly, only 5 European countries have ratified the treaty in the last 3 years. And despite the growing discourse of violence in the world. So this shows you that the issue has gained prominence. We might feel good that there are some policies here and there, but the level of actually having policies and implementing is very sparse, which still shows that in our mindset, our fundamental mindset, domestic violence is a prioritization. It is something between a woman and her partner, or a man and his partner. Because we must recognize men also can experience domestic violence. And 2 of the countries, of the 5 European countries that had ratified the ILO convention, had workplace policies earlier to the ratification. That is Spain, Italy. Before ILO convention, they had workplace policies in place. The other side is not only just to ratify ILO Convention 190, but it's also to see which countries have brought any kind of legislation on domestic violence leave policies. So this is an issue that is gaining prominence, and over a handful of countries have actually national domestic violence leave legislation. And literally a handful, 5, you count them. Of all the countries in the world, only about 5 have got this leave policy. So Australia, Canada is not a national legislation. There are provincial legislations and there is federal regulation. But there is no national law, no saying that domestic violence leave should be mandated. Spain, New Zealand, and interestingly, Philippines is the first country in the world to have had a national domestic violence leave as part of their Violence Against Women Act in 1994. Or 2004, sorry. So that was the first country. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Spain, and that now Ireland very proudly has joined this elite group of countries that have a national legislation. And what's interesting with the debate that happened in Ireland for the national legislation is that there were efforts going on from about 2018-19 that there should be some sort of domestic violence leave because the issue was coming up repeatedly in terms of trade union mobilization. And trade unions were actively saying that this is an issue. They had some particular specific unions had developed collective agreements where domestic violence leave was agreed to. And in 2019, Vodafone became the first company in Ireland to introduce domestic violence leave. At the same time, I was working in this project on Ghana, Pakistan, and South Sudan, where we surveyed women working in businesses across these countries and found how significant it was as a issue. And I took this research and made it available to the university, and I said, we should have a domestic violence leave policy. And with that, in 2021, our University of Ireland passed this domestic violence leave policy. So with the unions and with an educational institution passing domestic violence leave policy, created an environment for the Irish government to say, oh, maybe we should do something about this. But there was a significant amount of pushback for introducing such a leave. And where did the pushback come from? Largely the business associations. So we have IBEC, which is the Irish Business and Entrepreneurs Committee. And they said, no, this is not possible. It will be very expensive. There will be so many people who will claim this leave, and it will be unaffordable for businesses. It's exactly the same kind of arguments that were articulated by businesses in Australia and New Zealand and in Italy and Spain, when these legislations were actually talked about. And the Irish government finally said, because they pride themselves as a human rights champion, they knew that this would look really bad if they proposed and did not follow through on this legislation. So we now have, just in the last few months, there is now a domestic violence leave mandated legislation in Ireland. The argument has been whether it should be 5 days or 10 days, okay? And whether it should be paid or unpaid. And that is where the crux comes. In most of these legislations, especially in the initial legislations in Australia and in Spain, it was unpaid leave. And in the US, it's largely unpaid leave across the different states. But unpaid leave is ineffective. Unpaid leave is ineffective because the women who are working are often in the lowest wage jobs anyway. And for them, unpaid essentially means untaken, right? And so this is a big argument that's going on in domestic violence leave legislation, whether it should be paid or unpaid. The compromise now has been 5 days unpaid and 5 days unpaid. 5 days paid and 5 days unpaid. So that there's 10 days leave, etc. But the nature of leave, why is it important to have a specific leave called domestic violence? Because the argument has been that leave is leave, and there's sick leave, and there's annual vacation leave, and it's these you can use for whatever reason you want. So why should there be a specific domestic violence? It's essentially to ensure that it is seen as an important issue on which women can take leave as they require, not cutting into their sick leave and vacation. Because already they're doing that. 10 days is not going to resolve the amount of time women may need to use to recoup and rehabilitate from violence. But having something that's called domestic violence leave recognizes that domestic violence is an important issue. And hopefully it can reduce some stigma that it only happens to 1 or 2 women out there somewhere, who really are extremely bad, and that's why they have violence. But that it is something that happens to many women. So you have some progress being made, but much of Europe, much of Asia, much of Africa, much of Latin America, there is no domestic violence league legislation. And that is something that has to happen. But there are challenges in the existing laws, which I've been talking about a little bit. It's about, is it 10 days, 5 days, paid, unpaid? That's one big challenge. The next is that there's a lot more emphasis on having flexible work schedules rather than actually specific leave as per se. And that who can avail is actually highly limited because many of these national legislations are about the formal sector. And so there's a question of can small businesses, can small entrepreneurs actually afford this leave? So that is one. And most of the legislations do not include subcontracted workers, does not include domestic production workers, etc. So it's limited to the formal sector. Another issue has been the degree to which documentation is required. You have to prove that you're a victim of domestic violence. What proof do you bring? It means, again, then the leave is limited to those who have some sort of obvious injuries that they can document with photos and show. So that has been a big gap in a lot of the legislation. And it's not that directly that legislation says you must have proof, but there is an ambiguous language around whether proof is needed or not. And this is where employers push back. They say we need evidence that somebody has been a victim of domestic violence. How do you establish that? And then there's also a whole issue of misuse, and that employers require notice, advance notice, when you will take the leave. So that is another issue. Excuse me, I don't know if I might get beaten up next week, so let me tell you that I'll take leave. And so this is an issue, because ultimately one of the issues with most of these legislations is that it wants to uphold the employer's right to discipline the worker. Disciplining the worker means having stringent requirements around when you can take leave, for how long you can take leave, because leave affects the rhythm of work and the productivity of the business. So that's the fundamental kind of tension. While national legislations have issues, actually those companies that have implemented workplace policies have been more generous than national legislations. And their majority of companies have been taking action on workplace harassment and bullying. That has been the major arena of action. But independently of government legislations, many companies are beginning to introduce workplace policies and mandate leave within their HR policies. And in the US, it actually has been some of the large telecommunications, such as Verizon, Vodafone, AT&T, have taken the leadership in implementing workplace leave policies. And it's interesting that these are the companies where a significant number of women work. So they begin to see that it has direct impacts on their bottom line, because the majority of their workforce is female. What we could establish through a review of as many companies as we could in Europe and in US we found about only 12 companies had some sort of workplace policies on domestic violence. There are a few that have paid leave, and only 2 that give unpaid leave. So there's paid leave is yet not a significant aspect of domestic violence policies. But they all give support for counseling. They give some financial aid. They provide training, and they run campaigns. So they've started a little bit of effort of taking on domestic violence as a workplace issue, but they haven't yet moved forward. But the 5 companies that have introduced paid leave have been systematically 10 days paid leave. That's almost become a norm, that you must have 10 days paid leave. And I was trying to understand why 10 days paid leave. And what is interesting is that 10 days is 2 weeks. 2 weeks is often, if you have a robust legal system, is often the time that you need for getting a protection order. Mm-hmm. So it's very interesting how the legal system and what businesses think is the appropriate amount of time actually coincide. So 10 days is 2 weeks. And 2 weeks is something, it's a bit more than the 20 days for vacation, which is 4 weeks. And so it fits in with providing some support but not affecting the overall bottom line too much. That's where the compromise is. What's interesting is while few governments do have some legislation, few companies do have some policies, very few other organizations have anything on domestic violence. So in our survey, we found that basically educational institutions, there are very few that have systematic workplace policies. In UK, a survey of 153 universities, only 9 had some sort of domestic violence leave policy. Similarly, in USA, very few actually have an explicit policy on domestic violence. Some have domestic violence and sexual harassment. I don't know in Canada, I'd be interested to hear from you. While you have provincial legislation, has it really, it's one thing to have a provincial regulation or obligation, but it's another thing to have it actually articulated and stated explicitly in your human resource policies and in your leave policies. So I'd be interested to know to what extent educational institutions in Canada have this policy. What was most kind of depressing is that NGOs and bilateral donors that work on these issues, work on violence against women, work on gender equality, work on women's economic empowerment, don't have any policies around domestic violence as a workplace issue. It was really, really shocking. DFID, after our work, that is the Department for International Development, after we showed to them through all of these business surveys, said, oh, this is interesting. We must have a think about this. So they are thinking internally how to introduce some sort of workplace policy, leave policy on domestic violence. So are these domestic violence, I've made the case, I think, somewhat to why we should have a domestic violence leave. And the few policies that do exist, are they actually effective? So part of the problem is that there's hardly any evaluations that have been done on domestic violence leave policies. So one of the things is that while the policies are in place in some cases, even if they're in place, awareness that these policies exist is very low. So McGregor, etc., that's McGregor and Barbara, etc., have found in a study in Canada that only 28% received information on DV supports, including paid leave, whether there is leave. There is one study focused in Oregon that tried to assess the effectiveness, and they interviewed county employees and supervisors in the 27 counties of Oregon. Oregon was one of the first counties to have a specific domestic violence leave policy in place. 3 years after the implementation of that policy, they found 74% did not know that the leave existed, and 65% of the survivors said they would have used it if they had known it, right? So you can have a policy on your books, but is it being known and being used? And part of the policy issues with the leave policy was that there was still fear of job insecurity. That if you use the leave, then it becomes a sign that you're somehow less committed to your work. And so there was that fear of job insecurity. The leave in Oregon was unpaid, so the lack of payment was a significant barrier in people using the leave. There was, while leave is supposed to hopefully avoid stigma, there was a fear of stigma. 6 to 7% said they would not use the leave because of the stigma, and then confidentiality. 52% said confidentiality. And then another issue with the implementation of the policy was the lack of understanding of supervisors. That why does the woman not leave? So many a supervisor said, I'm willing to support, it's really terrible, it's an awful issue. But once I've given support, why doesn't she leave? I can do it once, but how many times can I do it? So not understanding the dynamics and the nature and the cyclical aspects of domestic violence leads to ineffective implementation. Because those who are supposed to respond thinks one response at one point is that's it, that's sufficient. And that resolves the issue. But unfortunately it doesn't, and so the repeat need for support is something then that becomes a barrier for employers to be proper, effectively. And so for supervisors, there is this fundamental conflict between productivity and safety. Which is more important? So safety might be important once or twice. After that, it becomes productivity. So here's the fundamental tension in a workplace leave policy. And another study in 2021 in New Zealand, which was a kind of a broad survey of policies in New Zealand, and not a specific interrogation of the effectiveness through an empirical study, but through kind of a contextual overview, said that the effectiveness of domestic violence leave policies is actually affected by several issues about the nature of domestic violence itself. One is the spatial complexity of domestic violence, that it is this public, private, and that boundaries, that shifting boundaries of public and private. So that only if employer sees that it's something in the private that is having a spillover into the workplace, is it seen as, yes, I should respond. But if it is seen as within a space that between the public and the private, particularly when women experience violence by an intimate partner on public transport, obligation to work. It's not seen as a private matter that has impact on the public space or the workplace. So that's interesting. This boundary between public and private is something that's very important. And then, as I said just now, the temporal complexity. It's not a one-off thing. And that because it's not one-off, that limits the effectiveness of implementation of domestic violence leave policies. There's also, and this is an interesting point that Weatherall, etc. raised, the domestic violence legislations and these workplace policies are framed in kind of a gender-neutral language, but it's still the language of victim. It's the victim who has to take the lead. It's a victim that needs support. And therefore, there's very little attention on the perpetrator. And what should be the response to the perpetrator? What are workplace policies around how you deal with someone who's engaged in domestic violence? And so, like in the World Bank, you often have these very prominent, not prominent, but really highly educated economists who have household staff or who have nice wives who sit at home who face abuse. And the World Bank has not figured out a policy to deal with these high professional men who are potentially perpetrators or are actually perpetrators. What do you do with their wages? How do you garner the wages in a way that it affects the perpetrator but doesn't deprive the woman who is dependent on that income? So there is a whole new area that we have to think about. If domestic violence is a workplace issue, then it's not only about the supports to the survivor, but it's about what are the repercussions for the perpetrator. And how does the place of employment deal with perpetrators? Because unless there is a complete recognition of the fact that for every woman who's receiving support, there is a man who is working in some place of employment. So it's something to think about. And of course, another big issue is the resources for the employer. I mean, large multinational companies can implement domestic violence leave policies. They have sufficient resources. But what about small businesses? Can all businesses actually implement? When I raised this in a forum where there was World Bank and WHO, large organizations working globally in the global south, they said, no, this is fine for the global north. This is not something that we can introduce to the global south, because too many small companies would not be able to afford it. If companies can't afford it, but if governments are obligated to address it, then there has to be different mechanisms. But it's not that the leave is wrong. It's about the mechanisms to fund the leave that has to be considered. Then finally, this is the last point. I'm sorry, did I run over?
Nope.
So this is the last point. Is there really any best practice? So I think the field is too early to say any kind of best practice. There are multiple toolkits that have been developed by trade unions as well as by some of the employers and business associations, having some fundamental principles, recognize, refer, respond, and so nice sounding principles, but there's no best practice. What's a particular kind of form that they should take? So I just wanted to end with something that I found in Papua New Guinea that was very interesting. which is that there's a model in which an NGO called Family PNG is providing information, crisis information, safe house, and psychosocial support for survivors of violence. But the NGO is financed by subscription from members, subscription from businesses, as well as other institutions that employ people, such as UN agencies. So businesses and UN agencies, etc., and even some government agencies subscribe. They give a pretty high fee. But then the services of this organization are available to all their employees as required. So the organization is obligated to give them the services. But because they have sufficient resources to the subscription process, they're able to offer free services to the public. So to women who may not be employed, who don't have a business sponsor. So it's a very interesting model. Or to women employed in very small businesses who are not subscribing to the family PNG, who can then avail of domestic violence leave, because if family PNG is providing the services, they do actually interact with the HR to say, a particular employee is with us, there is a serious situation, and he or she will leave for this period. So I found that as a very interesting model, which is basically to say that for this to be actually effectively implemented, you need a partnership. Businesses cannot be let off their obligation by saying, we refer you to some NGOs that will offer counseling, but that you have actively a set of services that are you build together, so that are then available to the women or men who are experiencing that. I want to bring in men because I think domestic violence is a woman's issue, but it is also an issue for men. And majority of victims across the globe are women, because it is based on fundamental gender power imbalance. But there are men who also are at the low end of that gender imbalance, and who also experience violence. So we must keep our mind open. So what we need to do next is actually, we need to show that domestic violence leave policies are effective. Of course, we could try and do some sort of cost benefit, but more importantly, I think we need to see to what extent does it actually impact upon this productivity loss that we've identified as crucial. And to identify key entry points for scaling up the business response, extending it to all different types of employers. When I say business, I am then including every institution that employs people. It doesn't have to be a business sector. And hopefully then, in 3 years' time, maybe we'll have enough evidence to say these are the best policies or best practices. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we have some time for questions. I'm also going to allow our Zoom people to join us. And we have, all right. Okay, so we'll start with this audience and then we'll move to the Zoom audience, okay? So anybody here who has a question for Nata?
I
Okay,
do.
Pasha, go ahead.
I'll go ahead. Thank you so much. It was very interesting and informative, and I learned a lot. It's not necessarily an area of expertise for me, but I work on gender and work, especially in the context of globalization, right? So obviously,
Yeah.
I know enough, I think. So I'm listening to it and okay, there's domestic violence, but it's defined as intimate partner violence, right? What I'm seeing in a lot of different sectors, especially sectors of employment that are increasingly employing women, and often women are considered better workers in, right? So call center industries, you know which ones I mean, garment industries. So when I do work with groups of people, of women, often they'll say, where's the violence coming from? Who are you, experiencing any oppression from? Especially for young women who are living with their natal families, or extended families, it's often not an intimate partner. So they'll say things like, my unemployed brother is the biggest sort of bane of my existence, and he takes my money and he beats, literally, like they come up with that, right? So I'm just kind of curious, there's a danger in defining it too broadly, I get that, but that's kind of like interpersonal familial violence, I don't know what else to call it, and I see a lot of that. Is there a way to configure it into thinking about domestic violence?
Okay, so
Yeah.
there is, in the sense that some of these policies have talked about family violence and saying that family violence includes intimate partner violence and violence by different members of the family. So parents, brothers, siblings, uncles, aunts, etc. So
Yeah.
it is, intimate partner violence is an example. The fundamental argument is that that which happens in the home
Yeah.
has implications for the workplace. We haven't made that connection. We think of the home as separate, the workplace as separate. So it's, I would say that in our policy at the University of Galway, we have said, we've tried to make it both violence by an intimate partner as well as any other member of the family, as well as including child-parent violence. That is a new form of violence that is increasing tremendously. So it's of anyone who is experiencing or supporting someone who is experiencing violence within this broad definition of violence. And we've made it gender neutral because it is trying to say that it is primarily women, but men also experience.
And also because it's about power, for example, same-sex couples, queer couples, it's
Yeah.
also fairly
Absolutely,
common.
yeah. And we know that violence among same-sex couples is, unfortunately, at the very same levels as within heterosexual couples.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
So, following up from some of the Canadian survey, Nadine and I were also involved in a survey around impacts and perpetrators of violence. And, one of the things that kind of stood out, wasn't really something in the report, but one of the things that stood out for me was the number of people who were business owners and self-employed. And then, on my spare time, I'm involved in domestic violence death review committees, right? And one of the things that keeps popping up for me is people who have committed domestic homicide, who've murdered their partner, who are also business owners or self-employed. And I live in the domestic violence world, I don't live in the work world. And I'm wondering if there are any frameworks or understandings that might be relevant, that may be relevant to what seems to be, there's no research yet on it, but it just seems to keep coming up.
No, I think that's quite a fascinating point. So you're saying that the perpetrator is
Self-employed or a
Self-employed.
business owner. Yeah.
Okay.
They're the one, they're the business owner. Sometimes they're the business owner, but like they're self-employed, i.e. they're I'm a contractor, I have a skill, for example, I might be an electrician and I contract myself out, or they're the owner, they're the business owner, I own the business.
Okay, and there's no involvement of the woman as an unpaid labor within that?
Well, there could quite possibly be the woman is unpaid labor in there, and those, yeah. And then I've actually been in a couple interviews that have been super complex, right? So with a woman trying to escape from a relationship with somebody who is her employer and her partner. But I guess that happens too. But I'm wondering, is there anything that we know or need to think about in terms of that self-employment that makes things different?
Well, I think with self-employment is probably more about the insecurity, the financial insecurity of self-employment. Because we know that when women go into self-employment, it's the most precarious kind of occupations, right? And even if a man is doing self-employment, it's precarious. And with precarity comes financial insecurity. With financial insecurity comes increasing tension. So you might have some frameworks around that links that might be useful. What I've heard much more is the murder and domestic violence that self-employed women face. So this is very interesting. I've not come across that a significant number of women who are killed or have experiencing violence are experiencing it from husbands or partners who are self-employed. In the global south, it's a lot about, and we know, so the other thing is, one thing we do know about violence is, and then I've looked at the employment status of the woman as well as that of the partner, is that unemployment of the partner is a significant risk factor for violence. And so you might want to think about what is the interaction between self-employment and the status of unemployment, because of its precarity. It's similar logic that's operating.
Other questions from Sergio? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering how much this has been tried to be integrated to other systems that might be in place. Like in my home country, the type of any work leave is actually done through your social security, like your health insurance. That's as a worker you have to have health insurance. If you need leave, your health insurance is the one covering, not your employer. Like your employer has already covered by paying part of your social security contribution. And so in that context, if somebody were to go to the whatever services there are, this vary by location, but however they're calling your location, you go, you say that you have this issue, that you're being persecuted by your partner or whoever one lives with you. They will in principle notify you will get leave in that way, without there being an official policy about domestic violence for leave. Would you be kind of integrated in this way? So you wouldn't call it that way. It's just that if you need leave, it's kind of integrated within the. I understand how there are issues calling everything a health issue or health policy. I don't mean it in that way. It's just that it's kind of integrated in the social security system, and so it's mediated through the same way as if you broke a leg. I'm not saying these are the same thing, just that the paperwork is the same.
Yeah, but I do know in Ireland also a lot of it is through this kind of social insurance, but still employers and national legislation does describe the number of days. So you have maximum of 3 months for any kind of injury or health issue, right? And then it has to be exceptional, and institutions articulate those policies. So it's not about how the leave is paid. What you're talking about, how the leave is kind of paid or accounted, or in which system.
I'm not so worried about who's paying, but more about how much our understanding of these types of policies also goes through how are they being integrated, whether they exist alone in my private employer hasn't for their own volition offer this thing, or whether they're integrated within a larger.
Well, I think in Ireland it's going to get integrated into the social welfare, so that if you don't have regular employment, it becomes part of the social welfare benefit, which is for being unemployed or being between employments. But it is also, every employer has to have policies on their books. And so I'm not quite sure what you are saying, that it's completely integrated into a national system. I'm not quite getting it because I would think that every employer has to have a policy on his or her books of what kind of leave is allowed or not allowed.
So
Yeah.
Sergio, is it mandated that if someone was to show up and describe sort of a domestic violence situation, that then
So
they
the-
would get leave?
So the thing is that the employer wouldn't be the one saying yes or no.
I see.
Like in the similar way that if you have an issue and your doctor signs a letter, you wouldn't go to your employer to get the leave. You'll go to, I'm gonna call it family services for lack of like a better name in my head right now, and like in that way like it's through that like they will like mandate.
Back to
Right, so
the
your
employer.
employer, like in this case, and again, I'm not saying it's a good idea or a bad idea, but in this case, you wouldn't find a domestic violence
Leave policy.
leave policy in your employers, but to the extent that you show up to the other authorities that will like be in
Yeah, but
place.
the
for these
other
things.
authorities have to recognize it
They will
as a
have to
reason.
recognize it. That's
Yeah.
essentially which I'm not saying that it's like necessarily a good idea or that like it works the way it is, but
That's a good way.
even though people will have like some access to these type of leave, you wouldn't see it in any employer's books because they will say, well, like by law, if you're mandated leave,
We give it to you.
we give it to you.
Well, so therefore, in your situation, it's important is to get the national law. That's all. But in countries like Ireland, etc., where employers are the ones, because there's a fundamental recognition that the employer has the right to discipline. So leave is seen as something that is sanctioned, that law provides a certain kind of umbrella, but the leave is actually sanctioned by the employer.
I should say also in practice, this almost never happens. That somebody's able to go through the normal system and get some type of protection. So I'm not implying that like this works. Like this evidently, like when you go and look at the data, this doesn't work. And as you say, we're painfully aware this is in the news. Like women do get killed in their workplace because like they even with the like. Even when they go to the authorities and they're like, yeah, they had said last week that they were looking for them to kill them, but
Yeah.
we're too late. So it's not about that as much as like just understanding how they are like, whether like these things work in tandem or like more focused on like the employer separately.
No, I think it depends on each national context. So, in places like Ireland, etc., they may not necessarily work in tandem. Vietnam is supposed to be all through health insurance, but they have not even worked out a place where if you go to the health insurance and say, I had injury because of domestic violence, now they finally accepted that that's a reason to accept that injury as valid and pay for the insurance. Before, it would be not accepted as a valid reason to have an injury. So the health claim would be rejected. So it depends on each country, each national context.
Hi, and I'm going to invoke Barb because she's on the phone as well, Nadine Wathen here. I think at one point we were talking about trying to also make it a workplace safety and insurance issue, in which case then there's a liability on behalf of the employer to ensure that there's safety in the workplace. So once they're aware that an employee is at risk, they have to sort of put protections around. So I was wondering how that was going, Barb, and nice to see your face. And if we've made any progress on that front.
We've made a little bit of progress, Nadine. Again, like Nata said at the beginning, we don't have a federal regulation. It's province by province and territory by territory. Ontario, again, was the first jurisdiction to include domestic violence explicitly as an occupational health and safety hazard. I think that's really important. Since then, Alberta has done that. I believe Newfoundland has done that. BC has it in the regulations. But I've heard several lawyers, and I'm not a lawyer, but I've heard several lawyers say that at this point, every occupational health and safety regimen in Canada it includes violence as a occupational health and safety hazard. Given the number of jurisdictions that specifically name domestic violence, it could be argued that any, whether or not it's explicitly in the legislation, any jurisdiction in Canada at this point does understand domestic violence as an occupational health and safety hazard. But that's a big theoretical framework. And I think some of what Nata's been talking about is the challenges that we have to get employers to really work with those concepts, to respect those ideas, and then governments to uphold them. So yes, we've made progress. The idea is out there. Federally too, it's the most recent federally regulated workplaces would be the most recent jurisdiction, both to give leave and to recognize, and they do use the language of family violence as a occupational health and safety hazard. So I think Adriana is on as well. Did you want to add anything to that, Adriana?
Whoops, sorry. I do, can everyone hear me? Because I just changed my microphone. I think what's really important is something that was pointed to in the talk, and that is the enforcement of the legislation. Because we can have a lot of legislation, but there's a lot of understanding still to be made on how domestic violence not only shows up in the workplace, but I really like the focus on the labor market and human capital. From what we've seen from our literature, from our research story, is that organizations do have, in many cases, policies. Workers are not aware of those policies. They are not used in effective ways. It becomes a sort of a tick box approach. And I think one of the important things is to move beyond that, that kind of an approach.
Yeah, because it seems we have sort of some carrots in terms of, saying you're going to enhance the productivity of your workforce and so on, but you might need some sticks, which is for boards, for example, to understand that this is risk management, that if you are aware that something's going on and it's an occupational health and safety issue and something does happen, then you are actually liable for it. And then all of a sudden boards and directors perk up.
Yeah.
To me, it also seems like protection from any kind of violence is also a social protection issue, right? So much like, so when you were speaking of Vodafone and these companies that are doing really well, it's fantastic, more power to them. I hope they keep that up. But there's always a danger in leaving that to the benevolence or the progressiveness of that company, right? So I think that's why, like maternity wouldn't have existed. That's why you need the state to be able to create that framework, that regulatory framework, because otherwise it can just as well lead to companies not hiring women, right?
Yeah.
Just like it used to for pregnancy before.
So I think we have time for one more question, and Nata, I see we've got, so Pramila, did you want to ask something?
Yeah, just wanted to add to the discussion about enforcement as well. So I work for an organization called Women Act, and we actually did a study a few years ago on the intersections of intimate partner violence, employment sabotage, so a lot of the techniques that you mentioned in terms of partners or abusive partners preventing women from working, or the abuse spilling into the workplace, and the intersection with race as well and racism. And what we found was something that stopped a lot of these racialized women from going to their employer or going to and using some of those laws was the fact that it was all on them. The responsibility was on them. The way that the laws work, the way that a lot of these policies work is they would have to report their employer if they weren't following or giving them domestic violence leave. And often the employers kind of knew that somebody who's a survivor is not going to have the emotional energy to go through a court case with their employer. And a lot of the times, unfortunately, this will happen, especially for racialized survivors. As soon as the employer found out that they were experiencing domestic violence, they were actually fired. So it's just something else to think about in the enforcement is, the role of the woman in the, oh, sorry, it looks like I have a bit of a notice thing. Oh,
You're
you still
okay.
hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, okay, sorry, I got a message saying something about lowering my voice. Computers. Yeah, it's just something to kind of think about in the enforcement is that the way that the policies are put in place is that it's the victim or the survivor who has to kind of raise the issue with the ministry or raise the issue that the employer isn't following processes, and survivors often won't have the capacity to do that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so I want to thank everyone for coming, and Nata's here for the next couple of days, Thursday and Friday, so if you would like to speak with her, just contact me and we'll find a time for you to be able to do that, and yeah, let's